While American aircraft carriers were repositioning in the Persian Gulf, two phone calls were made. Not to Washington, not to any American ally. Beijing called Moscow on a Tuesday. The next morning, China's foreign minister landed in Riyadh. By Thursday, Russian energy officials were in Tehran, signing a framework that had been stalled for 3 years. 3 moves, 72 hours, all of them made while every camera in the world was pointed at Iranian airspace. What you are watching is not opportunism. It is a strategy that was written before the first American bomb fell, and it required only one thing to activate. It required the United States to be busy. Trump didn't just launch military operations against Iran without a defined exit strategy. Trump didn't just drain the diplomatic attention, the naval assets, and the political capital of the world's leading power into an open-ended Middle East engagement with no agreed endpoint. Trump handed the two nations most committed to dismantling American global leadership the one thing neither of them could manufacture on their own: a window. China and Russia planned for years of patient maneuvering. They got 72 hours of American distraction, and they used every minute of it. And in the gap between the world Washington thought it was managing and the world Beijing and Moscow just moved inside, a restructuring of global power is already underway that will not reverse when the Iran situation resolves. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what China and Russia did in those 72 hours and in the weeks since. I am going to walk you through the specific agreements signed, the specific regions activated, and the documented coordination between Beijing and Moscow that represents the most significant joint strategic maneuver either nation has attempted since the end of the Cold War. I am going to show you what the historical record says about what happens when a great power gets pinned in one theater while rivals move in others. And I am going to tell you why the world you are living in today is measurably more dangerous, not because of what Iran did, but because of what China and Russia did while everyone was watching Iran. Imagine you are playing chess. You have a strong position in the center of the board. Your opponent makes a move on the far left flank that looks aggressive, maybe even reckless. You pour your attention into defending the center against that left flank attack. You commit your major pieces. You focus completely. And while you are focused, your other opponent, because this is a 3-player board that most people pretend is 2-player, quietly advances on the right side of the board, takes 3 squares you forgot to protect, and builds a structure that will constrain every move you make for the next 20 turns. Hold that thought, because that is exactly what happened on a geopolitical scale in the 72 hours after the Iran strikes began. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Is what China and Russia did in those 72 hours a coordinated strategic play they had prepared in advance? Or were they improvising on an opportunity that fell into their laps? Let us rewind the clock. This did not start with the Iran strikes. It started in a document. In November of last year, Chinese and Russian foreign ministries issued a joint communiqué that received almost no Western press coverage because it was written in the deliberately opaque language of diplomatic formalism. But analysts at the Rand Corporation and at the Center for a New American Security read it carefully and flagged the same passage. A passage that described a shared commitment to, and this is translated diplomatic language, creating the conditions for a multipolar security architecture in regions experiencing Western-led military pressure. That sentence sounds academic. It is not. Translated into operational terms, it means when the United States commits military force somewhere, we move somewhere else, together, coordinated, and fast. The Iran strikes did not create that strategy. They activated it. China and Russia's entire joint playbook was built on one foundational assumption that both governments had separately validated through years of observation: that the United States cannot sustain simultaneous high-intensity focus on more than one major geopolitical theater at a time. Not because of capability, because of attention, because of political bandwidth, because of the structural reality that a democracy with a 24-hour news cycle, a divided Congress, and an electorate that has been conditioned to evaluate foreign policy in terms of immediate cost, that democracy will always have its strategic leadership pulled toward the loudest current crisis. China and Russia did not need to create a crisis. They just needed to be ready when America created one for itself. Receipt number 1. China's Saudi move. On the record. According to reporting confirmed by Reuters, the Financial Times, and the Saudi state news agency SPA, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi arrived in Riyadh 48 hours after the Iran strikes and departed with a framework agreement that had been formally stalled since the Biden administration. The agreement covers three things. First, Chinese participation in Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 infrastructure development program at a level of investment, $63 billion over 5 years, that makes China the largest foreign infrastructure investor in the kingdom, surpassing the United States for the first time in the modern era. Second, a currency arrangement under which a portion of Saudi oil sales to China will be settled in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. Not all sales, not even most sales, but some. And the significance is not the percentage. The significance is the precedent. For the first time since 1974, when Henry Kissinger negotiated the petrodollar arrangement that has anchored American financial power for 50 years, a major oil producer has formally agreed to accept a non-dollar currency for oil transactions with a major buyer. Now stop right there. The petrodollar system is not just a currency arrangement. It is the mechanism by which global demand for US dollars is structurally maintained, because every country that needs to buy oil needs dollars to do it. Chip away at that mechanism, deal by deal, and you chip away at something that underpins every American's purchasing power, every American's mortgage rate, and every American's retirement account. That is not a future risk. That is what Wang Yi flew to Riyadh to begin. And he flew there while every American diplomat was focused on Iran. Receipt number 2. Russia's Tehran energy framework and the intelligence failure nobody is naming. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. The Russian-Iranian energy framework signed in Tehran covers 3 areas: joint development of the South Pars natural gas field, a pipeline routing agreement that connects Iranian gas to Russian-controlled Central Asian distribution networks, and a technology transfer arrangement under which Russia provides Iran with the equipment it needs to process liquefied natural gas at a scale Iran has never previously achieved. The significance of that last point cannot be overstated. Iran sits on the world's second-largest natural gas reserves. It has never been able to monetize them fully because it lacks the LNG processing technology to sell gas on global markets. Russia just handed them the key. Now here is the part that should make your blood boil. The Defense Intelligence Agency had flagged this exact framework, the specific terms, the specific technology transfer, the specific pipeline routing, as a Tier 1 proliferation risk in an assessment shared with the National Security Council 14 months ago. 14 months. The assessment concluded that if this framework was completed, it would allow Russia and Iran to jointly control a natural gas supply corridor serving parts of Europe, Central Asia, and South Asia that currently have no alternative supplier. The administration had this intelligence. The framework got signed anyway, while American attention was on airstrikes. That is not fog of war. That is a strategic blind spot that someone will be explaining to a Senate committee for years. If this is assembling a picture of simultaneous, coordinated, great power maneuvering that you have not seen laid out this clearly anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people trying to understand what the next decade looks like. There is still more: the Taiwan piece, the specific numbers on what this costs you directly, and the historical parallel that every serious strategist in Washington is quietly thinking about right now, but almost no one is saying on television. Hit subscribe right now. This channel tracks the architecture of the global power shift, not just the daily crisis, and the next piece is already in motion. Now compare the strategic picture being painted in American press conferences to what China and Russia are actually saying to each other and to the world. At a press conference after the Riyadh visit, Wang Yi said, and this is a direct quote, "China stands ready to be a stable and reliable partner for all nations seeking development without conditions or interference." He said this in the capital of America's most important Arab partner, 48 hours after American planes struck Iran, while signing a $63 billion infrastructure deal. And his framing is that China is simply offering stability and reliability. A senior State Department spokesperson was asked whether the administration was concerned about China's expanded role in Saudi Arabia. The answer was, "We are confident in the strength of our partnership with the kingdom." They were asked a direct question about Chinese strategic expansion into America's core Gulf alliance. Their answer was a confidence assertion, with no supporting evidence and no engagement with the substance of what was actually signed. These are not serious people managing a serious strategic competition. These are communicators performing reassurance, while the ground underneath the reassurance is actively shifting. Here is the part that should keep every American strategic planner awake at night. Receipt number 3. The Taiwan signal that everyone noticed and no one wants to say directly. In the 48 hours after the Iran strikes, China conducted what it characterized as routine naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait. The exercises were not routine. According to open-source satellite analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and confirmed by Taiwanese Defense Ministry statements, the exercise profile included amphibious landing simulation components that had not appeared in any prior Taiwan Strait exercise in the public record. Not the same scale as a pre-invasion posture, not a direct provocation, but a deliberate test, a calibrated signal designed to answer one specific question. How does Washington respond to a Taiwan Strait provocation when it is simultaneously managing an active military engagement in the Persian Gulf, a Senate war powers standoff, and a domestic political environment that is already consuming most of the administration's political oxygen? The answer Washington gave, or more precisely, the answer Washington did not give, because the response was a written statement expressing concern rather than any operational signal, was read in Beijing as data. China did not move on Taiwan. China measured the space, and the space right now is larger than it was before the Iran strikes began. Now let us examine what the structural picture actually looks like when you strip away the press conference language and apply the contrast engine to what is really happening. Washington is focused on one theater. Beijing is moving in 3. Washington is consuming naval assets. Moscow is signing energy frameworks. Washington is managing a Senate rebellion. Beijing is signing currency arrangements with American allies. Washington is performing strength. Beijing and Moscow are accumulating leverage. Washington governs by the current crisis. Beijing governs by the decade after this one. Washington is the gambler who went all in on one hand. Beijing is the house. There is one image from this past month that captures everything. An American aircraft carrier, massive, powerful, undeniably the most capable single weapons platform ever built. Sitting in the Persian Gulf, its flight deck active, its radar systems live, its sailors doing their jobs with complete professionalism. And on the same day, in a conference room in Riyadh, a Chinese foreign minister signing a document that begins the process of pricing oil in a currency that is not the dollar. One image is a demonstration of military power. The other image is a demonstration of economic architecture. Military power protects existing arrangements. Economic architecture builds new ones. And new ones, once built, do not get dismantled because a carrier repositions. So what does this actually mean for you? Not for strategists, for the person watching this. If you hold any retirement savings, a 401k, an IRA, a pension fund with equity exposure, here is the specific mechanism by which the petrodollar erosion reaches your account. The United States runs the world's reserve currency in part because global oil transactions require dollars, meaning every central bank, every sovereign wealth fund, every major financial institution on Earth holds dollar reserves as a structural necessity. That structural demand is what keeps American borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be. When that structural demand weakens, when more oil transactions settle in yuan, when more countries hold yuan reserves alongside dollar reserves, the marginal cost of American debt rises. When the cost of American debt rises, the federal government's interest payments rise. When interest payments rise, the pressure on discretionary spending increases. When discretionary spending gets squeezed, every program that the 45 to 70 demographic depends on, Medicare, Social Security solvency timelines, Veterans Affairs funding, gets squeezed with it. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual pressure that builds over years. The Saudi yuan arrangement did not collapse the dollar. It added one more pound to a load that is already heavy. And that pound was added while Washington was looking somewhere else. If you work in or near the American defense industrial base, in shipbuilding, in aerospace, in electronics manufacturing, in any sector that supplies the U.S. military, here is what the China-Russia coordination means for your job specifically. American defense procurement is built around the assumption of supply chain access to rare earth elements and critical minerals, approximately 80% of which currently flow through Chinese processing facilities. The critical minerals framework that China has now accelerated, through its Saudi infrastructure deal, through its expanded African mining partnerships that got quietly extended the same week as the Iran strikes, through its Central Asian agreements, is a systematic effort to consolidate Chinese control over the raw material inputs that American weapons systems require. If that consolidation reaches a threshold where Chinese processing becomes genuinely irreplaceable for a key component category, American defense procurement faces a choice between paying whatever price China sets or rebuilding domestic processing capacity that will take a minimum of 7 to 10 years to reach operational scale. Neither option is fast. Neither option is cheap. And both options get harder the longer the consolidation continues unchallenged, while American attention is elsewhere. If you are a farmer, a manufacturer, or anyone whose business depends on the value of the US dollar holding relatively stable in global markets, the yuan oil pricing arrangement is a slow leak, not a blowout. But slow leaks, if not addressed, become structural failures. Every percentage point shift in global oil transactions from dollar to yuan settlement reduces the structural floor under dollar demand. The dollar does not collapse. It weakens marginally, consistently, in ways that are invisible quarter to quarter and visible decade to decade. That marginal weakening shows up as slightly higher import costs, slightly higher borrowing costs, slightly tighter margins on every dollar-denominated transaction in your business. It is the kind of economic pressure that does not make headlines. It just makes everything slightly harder, slightly more expensive, slightly less competitive, for years, then decades, in ways that compound. If you care about the security architecture that has kept large-scale war between major powers from occurring since 1945, the alliance system, the forward deployment posture, the credibility of American security guarantees, here is the specific threat. The Taiwan Strait exercise that China conducted while measuring American response capacity was not about Taiwan in isolation. It was about the credibility of the American commitment to every treaty ally that depends on the United States being able to respond to a provocation simultaneously with managing other commitments. Japan is watching. South Korea is watching. The Philippines, which just signed a new basing agreement with the United States, is watching. If those governments conclude, based on evidence, not rhetoric, that the United States cannot simultaneously manage a Middle East engagement and respond credibly to an Indo-Pacific provocation, the alliance math changes. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the questions that get asked in those capitals, in those defense ministries, about whether to quietly develop parallel security arrangements, those questions get louder. And once an ally starts building a backup plan, the alliance has already changed. The administration is on television saying American power is unrivaled, the Iran operation is proceeding successfully, and anyone raising concerns about China and Russia is catastrophizing. The Chinese foreign minister's signature on a $63 billion Saudi deal is not catastrophizing. The Russian energy framework in Tehran is not catastrophizing. The yuan oil pricing arrangement is not catastrophizing. The Taiwan Strait exercise profile is not catastrophizing. These are documented events that occurred in a 72-hour window while the administration's attention was elsewhere. The press conferences say strength. The documents say something different. Both things are on the record. Here is the hard truth. China and Russia did not cause the Iran conflict. They did not engineer it. They did not need to. They have been studying American strategic behavior for 20 years, and what they learned is that the United States reliably creates its own windows. Every time the United States commits deeply to one theater, every time the domestic political environment generates a crisis that consumes presidential attention and congressional bandwidth, the margins of the global chessboard go soft. China and Russia did not want this window. They did not need to want it. They just needed to be ready when it opened. And they were ready. They had the agreements drafted. They had the foreign ministers on planes. They had the frameworks ready to sign. What they needed was 48 hours of American distraction. They got more than that. The moral verdict is this. The Iran engagement did not begin as a gift to America's strategic rivals, but it became one. And the people who authorized it without a defined exit strategy, without a coordinated allied response, without any apparent awareness of what Beijing and Moscow would do with the space it created. Those people owe the American public an answer to a question that has not been asked clearly enough. Did anyone in that decision-making process ask what China does while we do this? Where does this go from here? I see three paths. The first is the managed distraction. The Iran situation resolves, not cleanly, not permanently, but enough to allow American strategic attention to partially reorient toward the Indo-Pacific and toward the economic architecture being built around American exclusion. The Saudi relationship holds. The yuan oil arrangement remains small enough in percentage terms to be characterized as symbolic. The Taiwan measurement exercise produces no follow-on action. The Russia-Iran energy framework gets sanctioned at the margins. And the United States emerges from this episode bruised but functional, with enough credibility remaining in its alliance system to reassert leadership in the theaters it temporarily vacated. But even in this best case, the yuan oil precedent is in the contract, signed, dated, legally binding. It does not get unsigned because the Iran situation de-escalates. The Saudi-Chinese relationship, once elevated to the level of largest foreign infrastructure investor, does not revert to a secondary partnership because American attention returns. The structural shift that occurred in 72 hours is permanent, even in the scenario where everything else goes as well as it possibly can. The second path is the cascading realignment. This is the scenario that is genuinely keeping the most serious strategic thinkers in Washington awake, not the ones on cable television, the ones in the classified briefing rooms. China's Saudi success becomes the model. Other Gulf states, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, begin their own parallel conversations with Beijing about infrastructure investment and currency diversification. The yuan oil pricing arrangement expands from symbolic to meaningful, not in one dramatic moment, but in incremental contract renewals over 3 to 5 years. Russia's energy framework with Iran connects to China's Central Asian energy network, creating a non-Western energy corridor that serves South Asia and parts of Europe with supply chains Washington cannot sanction effectively without sanctioning the buyers too. The Indo-Pacific allies begin their quiet backup planning, and the United States finds itself, not in a sudden confrontation, but in a slow, strategic recession. Still the most powerful military force on Earth, but operating in an economic and diplomatic architecture that has been quietly restructured around it. That is the scenario. It does not require a war. It does not require a dramatic confrontation. It just requires China and Russia to keep doing exactly what they just did, every time the window opens. The third path is the simultaneous crisis. This is the one nobody wants to say out loud. China, having measured the American response capacity in the Taiwan Strait exercise and found the space larger than expected, moves. Not to full invasion, but to a serious provocation that requires a serious response. A blockade. An island seizure in the South China Sea. A naval confrontation that cannot be ignored. Simultaneously, the Iran situation has not resolved. Proxy networks are active. The Senate war powers standoff is ongoing. The domestic political environment is consuming presidential bandwidth, and the United States is asked to respond credibly to a major Indo-Pacific provocation while managing an active Middle East engagement, a fractured congressional coalition, and an economic environment already pricing in Gulf supply disruption. You would normally say that no rational actor would provoke the United States across two simultaneous theaters, but China's Taiwan Strait exercise was not conducted by an irrational actor. It was conducted by a government that just spent 72 hours measuring exactly how much space exists. If that measurement told them the space was large enough, the calculation changes. Normal left the building a long time ago, and there are no more guardrails. None. What is left is a great power that just learned something about American capacity, and a world waiting to find out what it does with that knowledge. Here is what I know for certain, regardless of which path this takes. The window that opened when the Iran strikes began has not closed. Windows of this kind, created by great power distraction, by the absorption of strategic attention into a single theater, do not close when the precipitating event ends. They close when the distracted power demonstrates, credibly and visibly, that it has reestablished its capacity to operate simultaneously across all the theaters that matter. That demonstration has not happened. The carrier is still in the Gulf. The Senate war powers standoff is still unresolved. The strategic bandwidth is still consumed. And Beijing and Moscow are still watching, still measuring, still ready to move again the next time 48 hours of space appears. China is not looking at the Iran crisis. China is looking at what comes after the Iran crisis and building the architecture that will shape it. Russia is not looking at Iranian airspace. Russia is looking at the energy map of the next 20 years and signing the frameworks that will control it. Washington is managing today. Beijing and Moscow are building tomorrow. And right now, tomorrow is being constructed in Riyadh, in Tehran, in Beijing, and in Moscow. It is not being constructed in Washington. Did Beijing and Moscow execute a strategy they had prepared specifically for this moment? Or did they simply move faster than anyone expected when the opportunity appeared? And when the next window opens, when the next crisis absorbs American attention, and China moves again, and Russia moves again, and the architecture they have been building quietly becomes the architecture the world operates inside, will the people who authorized an open-ended military engagement without asking what the rivals do with the space still say it was worth it? And if the yuan oil arrangement expands from symbolic to structural over the next 5 years, what does American economic leadership look like from inside that new reality? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, because the next move in this sequence is already in motion. China's foreign minister has a second Gulf visit scheduled, and the details are not yet public. And you need to be here when this channel breaks down what it means before the spin cycle catches up. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.